I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to be really, really honest with yourself. It's a question you've probably never actually been asked before. I mean, genuinely, completely, uncomfortably bored, and you just sat with it? No phone, no podcast, no music, no scrolling, not even a snack. Just you and that feeling of having absolutely nothing to stimulate you. Yeah, if you can't remember, you are definitely not alone. You know that reflexive, almost involuntary twitch to reach for your phone the second a moment of stillness arrives? Well, that little habit is one of the most consequential things happening to our minds right now. We're just surrounded by infinite content, instant gratification, and the result isn't a happier society. It's an epidemic of being unable to tolerate just ordinary life. And that is the central argument from Dr. Anna Lembke. She's the chief of Stanford's Addiction Medicine Clinic, and her book, Dopamine Nation, is a game changer. It uses the neuroscience of addiction to understand our modern lives. Her claim is pretty shocking. We've basically become a society of addicts, and the only way out is to go right through the discomfort we're all so desperate to run away from. Now, to really get this, we have to correct a huge myth. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. It's way more specific than that. Think of it as the chemical of anticipation, of motivation. It's the thing that drives you toward a reward. It gets triggered by the pursuit of pleasure, not the actual experience of it. And this little detail is where things get really, really interesting. So Dr. Lembke explains our dopamine system with this really powerful metaphor, a seesaw. She calls it the pleasure-pain balance, and it's a super simple way to wrap your head around some pretty complex brain science that explains why our modern lives can feel so draining. Okay, so here's how it works. When you experience something pleasurable, let's say you eat a delicious piece of cake, dopamine gets released and boom, the seesaw tips toward pleasure. But your brain, which is always trying to find balance or homeostasis, it immediately starts to compensate. And here is the crucial part. It doesn't just go back to the middle. It tips a little bit past the baseline into a state of pain. And that tiny little dip, that's what we feel as a craving for another slice. But what happens when you have repeated, intense stimulation, like, say, scrolling social media for hours on end? Well, your brain adapts. To handle that constant flood of dopamine, it basically turns down the volume by reducing the number of receptors. And the result? The same activity now gives you less pleasure, and your baseline mood, how you feel when you're not scrolling, is actually lower than it was before. This, my friends, is tolerance. You need more and more to get the same effect, and you feel worse when you don't have it. And this leads directly to all these behaviors we see everywhere. Checking your phone constantly, feeling that little hum of anxiety when you can't, needing to binge watch a whole series, or just being totally unable to sit in silence. According to Dr. Lembke, these aren't character flaws. They're just neurological adaptations to an environment that is bombarding us with excessive stimulation. So, okay, how does this actually play out in the real world? This is where Dr. Lembke makes it all so human. She uses case studies from her clinic, and with just incredible honesty, she includes her own story. Now, her addiction wasn't to a drug, it was to fantasy romance novels. She read them compulsively, hiding in bathrooms at conferences, staying up all night, until this fantasy world she was consuming felt more real and more desirable than her actual life. Her story makes the central point absolutely undeniable. Addiction doesn't require illegal substances. It just requires a brain, a pleasurable stimulus, and enough repetition. And this illustrates why the so-called high-functioning addict is often the hardest person to treat. It's not because their addiction is worse, but because their life has all this evidence of success, promotions, a stable family, that helps them sustain their denial. Their external functioning completely masks their internal dysfunction. For a while, anyway. So if that's the problem, what in the world is the solution? This is where Dr. Lembke's work gets incredibly practical. Her main clinical tool for a system that's gone haywire is a period of complete abstinence. She calls it a dopamine fast. And she recommends a minimum of 1 month, a full 4 weeks. Now, the first 2 weeks are almost always the hardest. You're going to feel anxious, irritable, the cravings are going to be intense. But listen, these are not signs that it's a bad idea. They are signs that it's working. It's the pre-existing dysregulation finally coming out into the open. Then, around weeks 3 and 4, stabilization begins. And this is the incredible outcome. By the end of that fast, most of her patients report that just ordinary things, a walk, a conversation, a sunset, they start to feel pleasurable again. Things that had just become background noise for a brain that was calibrated to intense stimulation finally begin to register. The world didn't change, your brain did. Okay, so now we get to the most challenging and maybe the most powerful part of her entire argument. The idea that the path back to well-being involves deliberately embracing discomfort. This is basically the pleasure-pain balance in reverse. Just like a strong pleasure hit ultimately tips the seesaw toward pain, a moderate, voluntarily chosen bit of pain, like a cold shower or really vigorous exercise, it tips the balance toward pleasure. Your brain compensates for the discomfort by releasing its own dopamine, leading to this genuine, earned sense of well-being. And this leads to a critical distinction Dr. Lembke makes between two types of pain. First, there's compulsive pain. That's the craving and the anxiety from a broken system. It's a dead end. It goes nowhere. But then there's generative pain, the discomfort of a difficult conversation, the effort of meaningful work, the vulnerability of real intimacy. This is the pain that builds a life. And here is the ultimate cost of our overstimulated world. When you use all these little dopamine hits to numb that compulsive pain, well, the anesthetic isn't very selective. You also numb your ability to tolerate the generative pain, the good pain that's required to grow, to connect, and to build a life of purpose. You blunt your capacity to do the hard things that actually matter most. Okay, let's wrap this up with 3 clear, actionable things you can do right now based on everything we've just talked about. First, just identify your primary dopamine source. What's the thing you reach for without thinking when you feel bored or uncomfortable? Is it your phone? Food? Social media? Just spend 1 day tracking it. No judgment. Just see it clearly. Second, consider trying a 30-day abstinence experiment from that one thing. I'm not saying forever, just 1 month, to let your brain's reward pathways reset. The discomfort of those first 2 weeks, that's the data you've been avoiding. The restoration in the last 2 weeks is what you're working toward. And third, introduce 1 small daily dose of voluntary discomfort this week. A cold shower, a skipped meal, a phone-free morning. Something small enough that you can actually stick with it, but uncomfortable enough to matter. And just notice how you feel in the hours afterward. Ultimately, this isn't about deprivation. Dr. Lembke isn't asking you to give up pleasure. She's really asking you to notice what you may have already given up in your relentless pursuit of it, which is the capacity to feel ordinary life as genuinely good. And that capacity, it's recoverable. But that recovery requires the one thing our modern world is designed to help us avoid at all costs. In the end, it all comes down to this one simple question. Can you sit with the discomfort long enough to let it pass?